The first cold front of the season skimmed the Arizona basin and left a breath of frost along the highway shoulders, turned headlights into pale tunnels, and made the creosote glint as if the desert had been dusted with ground glass. In that shallow blue hour between late night and early morning in the year 2000, Leah Morgan stepped out of a small stucco house on the edge of town, tugged a light jacket tighter around her, and sent a final line that sounded more like a promise than a plan. "I'm on my way." The screen glowed in her hand, the sending bar slid to full, and the night accepted it the way sand accepts a footprint, holding the shape for a moment before the wind decides what it will keep. She walked to her car. The engine turned once, then again, then caught, settling into the familiar chatter of something that had carried her down this road 100 quiet times. An ordinary departure, a simple route, 10 minutes, maybe 12, along a canal that moved like a dark ribbon under the moon, past low desert and the blinking red eye of a radio tower, toward a house where a kitchen light still burned because someone there always waited up. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the investigations. We follow cases where time goes quiet, but the evidence keeps speaking. The town felt smaller than any map could explain, because life pressed in close. A high school stadium that looked too big against the empty sky, a diner people still called by its old name, and the low hum of air conditioners stitching summer nights together until the weather finally broke. People worked hard, locked their doors out of habit more than fear, and measured distance by the number of songs on a cassette, or by how the sun slid down between the low mountains. Leah's last sighting was unremarkable in the way thousands of last sightings are unremarkable. A neighbor stepped out to shake a doormat and watched taillights draw a red line toward the intersection, where the sodium lamps pooled orange light like shallow ponds. The car paused. The right blinker ticked a soft metronome, then the turn, then the quiet. Frost pulled back when the sun rose. Coffee makers clicked on, sprinklers spun their silver arcs, and tires whispered across cracked pavement toward warehouses, classrooms, and job sites. In a one-story house, with a sagging Palo Verde out front, a phone lay dark on a kitchen counter. Its battery, not yet from an era when it could outlast a night. On the refrigerator, a paper calendar held a black marker lattice of days and shifts and small reminders. On the counter, a lunch she'd wrapped for the next morning waited cold and patient. In her room, the bed was neatly made, the window cracked to invite in the new cool, and a paperback open on the desk, like a bird frozen mid-flight. When the sun climbed and her chair stayed empty at the breakfast table, worry arrived without knocking. Calls were placed. First to Leah's number, then to the friend who'd hosted the evening, then to nearby homes where a porch light still burned because someone had forgotten to switch it off. The circuit completed quickly and returned to the same point. She had left, she had texted, and she had not arrived. By late morning, the tone inside the house changed. Silence, but not the peaceful kind. Rather, the held breath quiet that comes before you decide whether you're overreacting or finally acknowledging the thing no one wants to name. The call to authorities went out. A report entered a system where thousands of names wait in dim rows. The duty officer asked the practiced questions and logged the practiced details and typed the practiced provisional line. Last seen after midnight. Believed to be en route home. No known medical conditions. No indication of voluntary departure. Patrol units moved along the canal road, pausing to look over guardrails, slowing at pullouts, and sweeping light into ditches even though the sun was up. The desert is a tidy witness in daylight. It shows you broken bottles, boot prints, and scuffed earth where a coyote paused to nose something unfamiliar. It shows you tire tracks when soil is still damp from an irrigation release, then erases them by afternoon. At the first turnout after the canal, someone had traced initials in dust on the back of a road sign, and the wind had already taken half the letters. At a fence line, a white thread was snagged on a rusted barb. None of it meant anything on its own, And yet everything was noticed, named, and bagged, because sometimes the smallest thing holds the most weight when the light changes. Friends arrived at the Morgan home with orange juice and soft assurances, and those wide, searching eyes that make everyone glance at the front door as if it might open and end the scene. The local news caught the scent. A camera tripod grew out of the sidewalk concrete, and the anchor used her softest voice for the midday broadcast. A young woman missing, last seen leaving a small gathering, no sign of an accident along the route. Scenes like this flicker through the day's stream, here and gone. But sometimes one seizes a place and holds it in a quiet hand. The first afternoon had the look of a temporary disruption, because everything at the beginning feels temporary. Volunteers signed in at a folding table that rocked when the wind tugged it. Photocopied maps with dotted lines, marked zones, and creek beds and culverts where dust settled in neat layers. Bottled water clinked in coolers. And someone brought sunscreen because even in October the sun here knows how to press down. Foot teams move through arroyos with the careful cadence of people who do not want to destroy whatever they might be trying to find. Horse teams took the deeper washes and the faint illegal trails cut by off-roaders years before. A helicopter traced circles, like a stern reminder in the distance, the blades laying down a thudding rhythm that slowed the breathing of those walking below. At sundown, the temperature fell, and the wind turned thin and urgent. Flashlights wandered among cholla and saltbush, painting moving punctuation across the desert floor. At the edge of a tamarisk stand, someone found a gas station receipt, half buried under leaves. Timestamp close to midnight. Total small. A drink and gum. It slid into a plastic sleeve, with gloved hands, and a label written in the tiny letters of a person who believes in order when everything else slips out of line. The first night stretched, then let go. Morning came back with dry air, thin high clouds, and a polite layer of dust over every car in the cul-de-sac. There is a rhythm to these searches that becomes a liturgy. Gather, brief, assign, sweep, gather again, and report nothing without proof, and everything that might become proof. On the second day, a man walking his dog along the canal saw something bright snagged under roots, a small keychain with a token that could be bought at any roadside register and yet, in the right hand, meant home. The current slid by like a secret held under a smooth voice. The chain was bagged, logged, and touched with the care people use when they hope an object will speak. An investigator stood by the water and watched sunlight fight its way down to the pale silt. He wondered, as people in his job do, how many answers drift past beneath our lives, close enough to touch, invisible because we're not ready to see. The third day brought a press conference under a plastic canopy that squeaked as wind tugged at it. The spokesperson spoke of continued efforts, of neighboring agencies, of resources, and of next steps. The family stood nearby, in a halo of microphones. The sentence that broke something in living rooms across town was simple and true. She would not have left without saying goodbye. Those words hung in the dry air and shook loose the last polite doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a weekend that went long or a shame someone would return from with a stammered explanation. This was a torn link, dropped somewhere in the dark. And if the chain were to be mended, it would not be by chance. At the canal that evening, the light was the color of cool metal, and the sky felt too big. A patrol car idled with its headlights off. The engine's low purr felt like a promise to keep watching, even when no one was looking. Somewhere along that narrow ribbon of asphalt, time and motion fell out of step with the rhythm of this place. And within the space of a few minutes, Leah Morgan slipped between them. What happened in those minutes would haunt this town for years. The first week acquired its own calendar, an elastic stretch marked not by day names, but by what the search found and what it did not. Morning briefs bled into noon updates, then into evening debriefs, where maps accumulated thumbtacks like constellations that refused to align. On a folding table, in a borrowed community room, A detective set down a plastic evidence tray and gave it the sort of glance that says, "Make yourself useful." Inside lay common things made uncommon by context. A receipt with smeared ink, a keychain charm, and a thread of fabric that had traveled farther than anyone could explain. A whiteboard held a clean grid for the timeline. 12:08 a.m. Last message sent. At 12:11, a neighbor noted taillights. At 12:16, there was an unconfirmed sighting 2 intersections west where a tanker truck woke a dog. 12:20, nothing. The blank space after that hour felt like a cliff. People kept walking to stand on and peer over, hoping the drop was not as far as it looked. They called it a wellness check, but the officers moving through Leah's small house treated every room like a testimony. Shoes lined up beneath the bed, a light jacket on a hook, a compact on the dresser with a fingerprint the size of a coin, and a list folded into a wallet with grocery lines that looked steady. Milk, tortillas, and batteries, like someone who had not planned to disappear. On the counter sat a glass with a ring of orange juice drying on it, the sun catching it so it flashed like a tiny steel mirror. The refrigerator hummed. The air held the faint, hospital-clean scent of laundry dried indoors, because the air that week had turned too thin to dry anything properly outside. At the friend's house, where the evening had run its course, the living room still bore the marks of ordinary company. Plates stacked neatly, a pair of candles burned down and tunneled on one side, the wax leaning like a script written in slow motion. The friend, asked to repeat again what she had said already, pointed to the doorway where a goodbye had happened, and mimed the way a hand had drifted up to wave, a small movement that seemed, in hindsight, to have been the last uncomplicated thing in a complicated story. The canal grew into a character of its own, dark, inscrutable, moving with a steady indifference. On the far bank, utility boxes wore graffiti left by kids who wrote their names the way sailors carved them into wood, a declaration that they had existed. Divers considered the water's push and saw the silt like flower, ready to bloom into a cloud if touched. Instead, they sent a camera on a line that slid forward like a cautious thought, its light carving a white cone. Below, weeds waved their pale hands. A bottle winked, then turned faceless again. The camera found nothing. It knew how to name, and came back up with its cable dripping and the same old water running off the same old wire, patient as a clock. The first of the interviews began to confirm a pattern the town knew in its bones, but had hoped not to see. People tend to look away when the night is between days, and the air goes tin can empty. A convenience store clerk near the canal had seen a car pass at 12:14, the color a guess under sodium lamps, the sound thin because wind will carry that kind of sound away from the listener and back into the road. She remembered the way the headlights bent against glass and laid a smear on the candy racks. She had glanced up at the security camera screen and watched as every channel flickered, then went blank for half a minute, then returned with the same modest indifference. "A glitch," she said. "It happens sometimes when the cooler kicks on." The detective nodded, wrote the time, then took a breath that meant he would return to the camera later and ask it a more serious question. In the cul-de-sac where Leah had reversed out, neighbors began to keep their porch lights on too late and then forgot to turn them off. Coffee mugs cooled untouched as people realized they'd been watching the little clock through a conversation that had wandered, for the 5th time, back to the same point. No one spoke the word hope out loud, as if keeping it unnamed would protect it from the afternoon. The second week introduced a forensic ritual that looks boring until you understand its stakes. Soil from a turnout was bagged in a line, near edge, mid-edge, wheel rut, and beyond rut. A lab tech, her hands steady and wrapped, opened the bags and sieved each into a pan, then leaned close with a lens and a light she wore on a headband. What had seemed like ordinary dirt reassembled into a dictionary of tiny items. Sparkling flecks of glass, a bead of road paint, a bristle from a weathered broom, and an insect wing folded like a lost letter. Each went onto a sheet, each received a number, and each waited for the meaning it might offer. The canal road held tire marks from 1,000 vehicles, but an irrigation release on Monday night made a shallow glaze across a section of dust, and the first car through on Tuesday left a crisp set of tread blocks. A ranger who had spent a career reading the desert like a book leaned over that square of pale pottery and tapped the pattern with his pencil. Not a small sedan, he said, and not heavy. Something in between, something with a habit of the road. The note went to the board. The board looked back with the same cool patience. When the interviews turned to the hours before midnight, one detail sharpened. A call Leah had missed 20 minutes before she left. The number belonged to someone she knew from work, the kind of acquaintance that survives entirely inside the workplace and collapses into a nod if encountered at a grocery store. He had an easy voice at the station, a little too quick to answer, but not suspicious for it. He had called, he explained, because he thought he'd left a folder in her car earlier that week. He hadn't. He found it. He forgot to call back because the next day was busy. She didn't answer. No big deal. The detective nodded and wrote and said he might ask more later. Later arrived. The logs showed the call lasted 9 seconds, enough for a ring or two, then voicemail. The coworker had made 2 calls that night, the other to a number up near the freeway, and both had pinged off a tower not near his house. His explanation that he'd been out for a late-night drive to clear his head went into a statement with the same neutral language applied to every sentence in this kind of file. Subject states, subject claims, subject reports. In kitchens across town, radios lowered their volume when his name came up in whispers. The department did what departments do in a first month. It cast a wide, careful net over the most obvious bodies of water and the least obvious corners of human behavior. It looked at the friend group because the friend group is always the first circle. It looked at the family because that is the second circle. It looked at the ex-boyfriend because even when the time since a breakup stretches cleanly, the line remains tethered to both ends. The ex sat with a public defender and a soda can and said the things that try to keep distance honest. We're fine. We're not close. We're not enemies. The search of his small apartment found nothing beyond the ordinary disorder of someone who keeps too many receipts, because receipts are little apologies we grant ourselves for the shape of our lives. The third week taught the town that absence has weight. Posters lifted at the corners and snapped against lampposts. Volunteers reduced to the determined core were the ones who had organized supply bins and carried first aid kits and wrote their phone numbers in Sharpie on the underside of their wrists, because they understood that a phone can arrive in a pocket already out of battery. A retired teacher made a spreadsheet with a kind of fierce compassion and tracked which drainage ditches had seen boot prints and which had swallowed them. An empty plot at the edge of a failed development told the same story 3 times. The wind comes through, the wind goes quiet, and the wind comes through. That third week also delivered something small that tilted the narrative an inch and made everyone nervous about what might be waiting if it kept tilting. A city worker checking irrigation gates along a concrete lateral found a scuff on the railing where a bumper had leaned and rubbed off a stripe of clear coat. 5 feet away, a bolt holding the mesh to the frame had loosened and hung with its washer shiny from friction. Below it, in weeds too dry to hold shape, lay a clear plastic fragment the size of a matchbook with a stamped number and a curve that suggested the corner of a taillight lens. The fragment went into a bag and from there into a lab, where a database of parts and numbers told a story about make and model years and manufacturing runs. It did not say a name, but it whispered the kind of thing investigators can touch with their minds. Someone paused here. Someone backed too far. Someone corrected quickly. A detective held the fragment up to the light by the window. The sun turned the plastic rosy. On his desk lay photos of Leah's car, its rear lamps intact in every old picture. The detective set the fragment down and stared at the tiny stamped code as if he could will an answer to rise out of it like heat. Out along the canal that night, a dust devil found its shape in the last warm light, then collapsed, leaving only a dot of stillness that lasted too long for comfort. The routine persisted. Search, document, repeat. Yet inside the routine, a tension gathered that felt like that second before a record drops into a new track. In an office that used to be a storage closet, a young analyst stared at a screen that plotted cell tower pings across a map. Her finger traced a path for the coworker's phone the night in question, then paused when the dots drifted toward a service road that shouldn't have been on anyone's route home. She pulled older records, built a thicker line, and saw that this road had hosted the phone more than once in the previous month. Late, always late. She opened a new file and wrote a note that would move the story forward in a way no one had dared to claim yet. It was short. It was careful. It closed with a recommendation that had become the quiet prayer of the case. Return to the road with better eyes. The road the analyst circled on her screen looked ordinary in daylight. An access strip stitched along the canal, with sun-bleached gravel in the center, and darker ruts where tires had pressed a routine into the ground. It served floodgates, power lines, and nothing else, which meant it served as a theater for things people preferred not to rehearse in public. At noon, when the department returned with better eyes, the heat lay flat against the ground and erased shadows until objects seemed to hover. A sergeant marked off 50-yard intervals with orange flags. A photographer worked low, shooting each tire depression like a portrait meant to speak for itself. A small team followed, eyes down, and discovered how a place becomes articulate when you give it time. They found a twist of baling wire that had been used to keep a chain quiet. They found a cigarette butt halfway buried in silt that told its own short story about hesitation. They found, nestled in blue stem and brittle purslane, a plastic clip with a faint tooth mark, probably from someone who worked with their hands and held small things between their teeth when focus demanded it. The clip was common. The tooth mark was not. They bagged it. Half a mile in, the road kinked slightly around a stand of tamarisk. In the nook formed by the bend stood a drainage gate, with a metal grate bolted to a frame. Spiders had written the corners. A chalky imprint on the frame, hip-high, shaped like a smudge that might have been fingers once, resisted the brush and gave back the smell of water and iron. A newer bolt shone among older ones, like a bright tooth in a long jaw. The sergeant tightened the perimeter and lowered his voice. Whatever had happened here had entered the physics of the place. At dusk, when the wind gained its evening voice, it knocked the reeds together with a sound like dry applause. The team waited for the air to thin and gave the night back its control. They came again the next morning with a magnet rake and pulled along the verge where an engine might cough and someone's panic might loosen a grip. The rake caught a twist of foil, a small screw, and a shard of something glazed. The shard, washed in a cup and shown to the light, held a faint grid of red and amber that made the technician's eyebrows lift. "Taillight," she said softly, and then said the words every investigator says when fear and hope are married: maybe. A year before, a county grader had smoothed this lane and reset its posture. Witnesses do not survive maintenance, but memory leaks around the edges anyway. The road manager checked logs and located the grader operator, a man with a hat line permanently on his forehead. He stood with the teams and pointed. "Over there," he said. "That patch I had to run twice. It had dried hard like a low tray." It could have been from someone hosing a radiator or washing off dust, but it seemed strange given the distance to any spigot. He remembered that a truck had pulled past while he paused to sip water. He remembered the truck's engine settling instead of shutting off. He remembered the way the driver watched the rearview mirror, as if the mirror was telling him something he wanted to hear twice. The operator had a habit of noticing things, because machines will punish you if you don't. He signed a statement that looked like a map drawn from a bench in the shade. With each pass back and forth along that road, the case gathered more threads and began weaving counsel around a single idea. Return with questions tuned finer. Return with quiet. Return until the place answers without being asked. So they did. The analyst who had traced the dots laid out an overlay of device movements for the hour after midnight across a month on either side of the night that mattered. 4 shapes emerged in the data, like the way a constellation does dots that don't speak to one another until someone lines them and says aloud what everyone can then see. The coworker's device had drifted near the service road 4 times, always on nights when wind carried dust low across the wash. The kind of nights you have to roll a window up and then down again because the glass refuses to find a clean angle. The pause durations were uncanny in their sameness. 7 minutes. 9. 7. 9. On the night Leah left, the device paused for 12. The analyst, whose mind liked symmetry until it betrayed her, drew a circle around the 12 and felt her neck warm. 12 left room for a person to change a mind and then not change it back. The map and its circles generated a formal request. The department secured a court order for detailed historical location records under the narrow scope allowed, and waited out the clerk's calendar. While they waited, they did not sit still. A patrol stopped by the convenience store on the far side of the canal, where the clerk had mentioned the cameras that fluttered and blanked for half a minute. The tech climbed a ladder into heat and opened a metal cabinet, inside of which wires looped in disciplined arcs, like vines trained along a trellis. He cleaned contacts, reseated a power supply, and reviewed logs. The blanking repeated 10 times in the past year, all within a 2-hour window bracketing midnight. The power draw of the cooler, which the clerk had offered as a culprit, did spike when compressors cycled, but not at the precise moments in question. Something external caused the drop. Maybe a passing vehicle with a radio array in poor health. Maybe a bad ground in the pole's panel. The tech couldn't swear in court either. He could write a memo that said, "This should not happen. It does. Here's when." The timeline grid on the whiteboard accepted the memo like a new tile added to an intricate floor. In the second month, a woman came forward who had not seen anything but had heard something. A metal sound, carried oddly and presented to her ear like a coin rolling across a tabletop. She had been in bed, half asleep, the way you are when you fix on a noise that doesn't belong, and she had followed it conceptually out of her room and onto the street, and the street had led to the canal, and the canal had carried the sound away. In daylight, embarrassed by the vagueness, she gestured with her hands anyway, rolling an invisible coin between her fingers, until the detective copied the motion and then wrote, "Object scraping grate?" She felt relief at seeing the words exist outside her. Another lead came not from the air, but from a notebook that had sat quiet in a box for weeks, because every file contains a small, stubborn thing that refuses to be boring until it isn't. In an initial canvas, a volunteer had noted a chain-link gate behind a storage yard with a new lock, but old dust clinging to the links. He had listed it, then moved on. The second pass gave the gate more attention. The lot's manager explained that the lock had been changed after a break-in a year earlier. He shrugged. Thieves like copper. But the security camera, aimed at the gate, was on a timer and recorded small, improbable hours. The detective asked to see them, and then rewound 2 months to a night that looked like all other nights and was not. Headlights arrived, paused at the gate. A figure stepped out, used a key or a key-sized tool, swung the chain, then changed his mind and swung it back. He stood a long time in the bright wash, like a man undecided about whether or not his own ideas could be trusted. The footage was low resolution and gave him no face. It gave him a habit, the way he raised one shoulder while turning, as if the shoulder had learned to protect a nerve. The analyst froze the frame where the figure folded back into the driver's seat and saw a pale cylinder against the dark. Maybe a thermos, maybe a bottle, maybe the shape of a small flashlight. Out in the desert beyond town, a search grid moved across ground that looked the same in every direction. Volunteers wore cloth over their mouths and breathed through fabric faintly scented of detergent. They marked anthills so they would not stand on them and upset the quiet civilization there. They lifted strands of fencing and looked along the line for snags. They found nothing with a name. The absence pressed, and the heat did too. And people found their limits in honest ways, and stopped when their legs suggested they stop and drank water, when their lips announced that water would be a good idea now. On the 50th day, something finally gave a small sound, and brought the world to a point so narrow that only one detail could fit through. A maintenance worker clearing drift along a lateral ditch saw, caked in mud and wedged among tumbleweed that had braided itself into a mat. A rectangle of thin metal, with a sequence of numbers pressed shallowly, and a punch-out hole torn along one edge. He washed it with his drinking water, and the numbers emerged. And he didn't need to know exactly what they meant to understand they meant a lot to someone. The tag was not a license plate, though it had belonged near one. It was a compliance tag from a parts manufacturer that dated a run to a window of months and associated it with a narrow list of vehicle models. The run overlapped the year of Leah's car. In a cluster around a desk, the team traced supply chains on paper and traced darker lines on the board. The road, the gate, the grate, and the tag were not yet a case. They were a scaffolding the case might choose to stand upon if it could. Inside the building, where swamp coolers pushed a soft roar through every duct, a detective held the tag between thumb and forefinger and felt the weight of thin metal as if it were anchor steel. He set it down, picked up a pen, and wrote one word beneath the timeline that would shape the next month's work: downward. The word written beneath the timeline sent everyone's attention toward the places where water goes when most people aren't looking. Downward meant culverts and sluices. It meant the undersides of bridges and the hollow sound a pipe makes when you carry your voice toward it. It meant maps that show the skeleton of a valley instead of its skin. The county water district opened their records to the task force, and a young engineer unrolled charts speckled with notations in pencil, the kind of notes you make after years of walking the same catwalks and counting the same bolts by feel. He traced the canal segment that ran parallel to the service road, knuckled the air when he reached a crossgate assembly, and explained how debris collects where decisions are forced on water. "We clean these after storms," he said. The decision brought the team under a noon sky to the gate that had caught their attention days earlier. On its surface, the grate looked like a grid of dark metal and prediction. Up close, it looked like the way stories end when no one fights for them. A crane truck idled. Two workers in harnesses clipped on and moved with choreography, learned over hundreds of routines that never asked them to think in terms like evidence. The gate lifted in small, grudging increments. The pool behind it belched a breath that smelled like iron coins. The first rush brought a rip of tumbleweed against the bars. The second delivered soft shapes that had forgotten their edges. The workers waited for the water to settle and reached in with hooks, catching plastic, branches, and an old tarp that had folded into itself like a dark blossom. They set each thing on a tarp on the bank, and the detective assigned to that tarp counted quietly to himself as he photographed. One object refused to give itself over. It shone black with algae and told no truth until a gloved hand made it do so. It was a length of synthetic webbing threaded through a small metal tongue, the insert of a seatbelt, still latched to a short stub of strap. The technician's face changed in the way faces change when what they're seeing clicks into a story they were hoping not to tell. She rinsed it with bottled water, and beneath the algae the metal wore a code stamped shallowly by a die years ago. She wrote the code in her notebook and held the webbing to the light, angling it until a faint line of adhesive revealed itself along one edge, interrupted by a curl of fiber broken and then smoothed by time. She pointed silently. The others nodded because silence had better gravity here than speech. They bagged the piece and bagged the algae because sometimes what clings more willingly holds more of what you need. They kept going. A magnet dredge pulled across the gate's downstream throat, collected a fist of small ferrous things, screws, washers, a buckle, claw, and a slotted bolt whose threads wore a sheen that suggested recent force had insisted it move. By mid-afternoon, the tarp had become a ledger. The engineer who had drawn maps watched in a quiet silence. No one noticed until they noticed he hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He had rebuilt pumps during blackouts and had coaxed power back through tired systems to make a city keep its bargain with its residents. He watched now as a different kind of power. Time, attention, and relentless willingness sorted junk into categories with names. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, why the word downward had made his shoulders tense. The lab took custody and divided each piece by task. The stamped code on the belt insert led to a manufacturer's archive, not meant for public eyes, but numbers obey their own mercy. The code matched a production batch used across a family of vehicles during a range of months that sat like a transparent overlay directly over the month that mattered. The adhesive along the webbing edge glowed faintly under alternate light, the kind of glow that comes from tape once hugged tight to a surface. The curl of fiber at the break, amplified under a scope, became a little landscape: frayed peaks, a canyon where a sharp edge had pulled, and a plateau flattened by pressure and then glossed by silt, sliding back and forth over years of small floods. The materials scientist wrote a report with words that could live in court. The strap section is consistent with occupant restraint hardware from the identified production batch. The break is consistent with a cut made by a narrow, sharp tool rather than a tear by force. In the same report, where scientists sometimes allow themselves the smallest moment of narrative, she wrote, "Whoever handled this wanted the strap to end and made it end. The algae wash produced something no one dared expect, and therefore the room in which it was announced held itself very still." From the adhesive's faint residue, the lab lifted a small clutch of cells and found, within them, enough to build a partial profile not belonging to the missing. Partial profiles live in the tense middle of criminal work. They are not enough to stand alone, but they are enough to point like a weather vane toward where a storm will soon be visible to everyone. The database returned no immediate hit. A technician who had learned patience by losing it too often marked the sample for future comparison and labeled it with a code longer than it needed to be, because length sometimes feels like protection. While the lab worked, the detectives turned to where the strap might have once lived. Downstream of the gate, the canal widened its shoulders and curved toward a siphon where water crossed beneath a feeder road. The siphon's intake had a secondary grate that could be removed with a comedic overabundance of caution. They chose caution and unscrewed each bolt like it might be a reliquary. When the panel came away, a space revealed itself, a pocket in the masonry where water eddied before deciding to commit. In that pocket, a single object had refused, for years, to abandon its shape. It was round, thin, and wore on one face the faint ghost of a brand one might recognize if one had seen it every day for several years. The detective felt inappropriate triumph, and then checked himself. He photographed it in place, then lifted it. It was a coin from a laundry machine, the kind you keep in a cup near a dryer when you share spaces with strangers. The cup had once belonged to someone who lived a life with chores, and those chores had left this small token of ordinary repetition under an extraordinary weight. The coin would not carry DNA reliably after the baths it had taken. It would carry suggestion. Suggestion, by now, was becoming a kind of currency. The team spent a day with the Water District's archived photographs, the ones workers take to prove that a job was done and then put in folders because memory eventually stops working alone. A set from the spring after the month that mattered showed the same gate, the same siphon, and the same curve of concrete. A smudge in one frame near the grate's base had the right geometry to command attention after the fact. A rectangular shadow, darker than the dark around it, as if something had rested there, and then not. They couldn't prove that something was from pixels out of time. They could prove this: the area had been disturbed when it should have been boring. The rumor of activity, whispered softly by geometry, was enough to authorize another kind of look. A sonar team from a neighboring county wheeled in a cart that looked like an instrument vomited by a science museum. They floated the transducer on a tether and let it read the canal bed in fan-shaped sweeps. The monitor drew ghost pictures with dots that learned, from repetition, how to become an outline. At the downstream bend, near a deepening that shouldn't have been there if you trusted the original grade, an object announced itself as stubbornly as a confession. Long and low, with corners softened by time, its top collapsed a little like a lung not fully filled. The operator did not say the word everyone already had in their head. He tapped the screen instead and dropped a waypoint in digital space. On shore, where rebar rusts no matter how you ask it not to, the sergeant weighed risk and optics and the way a city judges its servants when they fail to try versus when they try and fail. He called the chief, who called the mayor, who called back with his jaw locked. "Do it right," he said. "Do it slowly." The crane returned. Divers slid backward into water that held past summers and last winter, and a night you can't name without changing the air in the room. They ran hands along silt until the sound changed. Sound travels differently along metal than along mud. Every diver knows the difference, the way pianists know the weight of their own keys. A rectangular frame yielded to the probing like a reluctant thought. Cables went down and found purchase. The first lift failed because the angles were wrong. The second lift spoke the language of leverage. The object rose, mantled in weeds, trailing a veil of black water like a cathedral's grief. On the bank, the detective who had written downward on the board steadied his breathing with a technique someone had taught him after a funeral that arrived too soon. The crowd at the temporary perimeter talked in whispers because the desert teaches quiet when it wants to. The long shape turned in the sling and offered the hint of a seam where glass meets frame. The air seemed to thicken, then thin, and the crane operator, who had done this with generators and culvert pipes, and once a horse that had fallen through rotten decking, feathered the controls with a respect that read like prayer. The object kissed the bank and settled, and in that settling something essential about the case shifted, like a door unseen in a room you thought you knew, suddenly opening onto a hall you had hoped for and dreaded. It was not yet identified. It did not need to be. The next part of the work, slow, controlled, and careful with cameras and gloves and hearts, would tell the story the water had tried very hard to keep. The object on the bank looked less like a machine than a memory encased in river skin. Silt clung to the panels as if it had learned devotion over years. Weeds looped from the undercarriage like faded streamers from a party no one wanted to remember. The team threw a tent of shade over it and sealed the perimeter tighter. Cameras clicked in triplicate. Tape measures stretched from fixed points to corners, as if geometry itself could slow the tremor moving through the day. They did not pry. They did not yank. They whispered the procedure to one another, like catechism. A mobile lab had been idling in the access lot since morning. Its doors opened on a choreography of trays and light. The evidence paper rustled. A photographer with a lens as long as a forearm made a ring around the object, capturing each angle before the first touch. The lead technician leaned in and drew her gloved finger along the seam where glass should have been. The seam was there. The glass was not. The side windows had fractured and slumped long ago. leaving toothy arcs of safety crystal cemented by algae at the corners. The windshield had collapsed inward and then settled outward again during the lift, leaving a jagged grin. Through that gap, a smell rose like a buried season. It was not the smell of rot that had been taken by years, but the smell of closed air, metals oxidized into a soft whisper, and fabric that had soaked and dried 1,000 times until it could no longer remember its original hand. They inserted the end of a borescope, its tiny eye becoming a proxy for everyone who could not bear to look and could not bear to look away. The monitor bloomed with a tepid light. Inside, the front seats had discolored into anonymous brown, the dashboard slumped like a tired face, and the steering wheel wore a crown of mineral fringe. The camera panned to the driver's side floorboard and found a shape that was not debris. It was the negative space of knees forever bent, the contour of a human form held by belts long since rotted at their perforations. Silence thickened, then thinned again, because silence cannot hold forever in the presence of hard truth. The coroner on scene stepped to the tent flap and paused in the light, in that small, formal way people adopt when they are about to speak for the dead. "We proceed as if she is still waiting for us to be gentle," she said. The seats were unbolted in sequence, each fastener coaxed rather than forced. The skeletal remains were lifted by the board, hands moving in a slow geometry around the hips, the ribs, and the skull. The seatbelt tongue still sat in the buckle. The belt itself had parted where a sharp edge would have made a clean argument against continued restraint. The buckle's release button wore a thin fur of algae. The technician bagged the tongue and buckle in separate pouches, as if they could tell different versions of the same sentence. A small, glittering object slid from beneath the seat and caught against a ridge of silt. A pendant, heart-shaped. Its chain knotted around itself, as if it had been wound and unwound by an anxious hand many times before the day that mattered. The coroner's face did not change, but the camera caught the tiniest stutter in the way she inhaled. They found other things that had resisted the water's appetite. A compact mirror, cracked but still dutifully hinged, its inside rim filmed with a faint, ancient dust that once had been the color of a morning routine. A key fob with buttons worn to an anonymous gloss. A library checkout slip, its ink transformed into a pale watercolor, but the date block still legible if you squinted and believed. A spiral-bound notebook, swollen and silt-heavy, its first pages fused, its last ones opening like the fronds of a winter fern. Each artifact slid into its own envelope, with a label that would later seem comically small for the weight it carried. The shell of the machine gave up its identity the way tired things do. Reluctantly, then all at once, the vehicle identification plate at the base of the windshield had corroded to a cough of numbers and letters. But on the frame rail beneath the driver's seat, the stamped characters had been hidden from the worst of the water's persistence. Under angled light, with a brush, with time, the characters reasserted themselves, a sequence that matched a registration in the state system. The detective, who had made calls no one should have to make, pressed his lips together and nodded without looking at anyone. The notebook went to a drying chamber where desiccant eats time's work one grain at a time. Conservators teased the pages apart with tweezers thinner than worry. On the fifth sheet, a list of errands bloomed faintly. A reminder to call about a tutoring schedule, a milk and bread grocery shorthand, and a note to text a friend when home. On the seventh, a name was written twice, like rehearsal, then crossed out, as if seeing it in graphite had felt like a trespass. On the back cover, an address of a trailhead was penciled in a hurried, hopeful hand, with an arrow pointing to it as if the future needed direction. The lab took swabs from the steering wheel rim, from the turn signal stalk, from the inner door handle, from the seatbelt hardware, and from the pendant chain. They took scrapings from beneath the driver's fingernails, although time and water had sanded most surfaces into an equal silence. They vacuumed the footwells with filtered suction to collect the fine grit that sometimes hides skin cells too stubborn to dislodge otherwise. They lifted a partial print from the back of the compact, a crescent arc that spoke of a last reflexive check in a mirror, and marked it for a comparison they doubted they would get. The coroner sat with the bones, reading them like a biography without adjectives. Female, late teens to early 20s, stature within the range that matched the file. A healed fracture on the left ulna from years earlier, the kind you earn in younger misadventures, matched an old medical report in the box. Dental comparison was not poetry. It was numbers that fit into numbers, lines that matched like train tracks sliding into a curve. Later, the report would use phrases like highly consistent with and identification supported by, but in the bright silence of the tent, there was a different kind of certainty, the kind that lands not in the mind but in the sternum. News traveled along the channel. It always does, from phone to phone, voice to voice, until it reached the living room, where a father had been practicing breathing for months. He listened without interrupting and set the phone down very carefully, as if a careless motion might spill what little remained. Then he did the one thing he had promised himself he would do when the day came. He stepped into the room his daughter had left behind and opened the blinds all the way so the light could finally touch everything again. The science kept talking. Under alternate light, the driver's seat fabric declared a constellation of stains that years had thinned but not erased. The patterns mapped the kind of contact that happens when someone leans across another to reach a latch. The stain near the shoulder belt anchor, small but stubborn, offered up a partial profile, not the driver's, not the family's, the same particle that haunted the adhesive on the severed strap. The lab tech, who had been patient before, was patient again, and this time she found a little more. Enough markers to move a profile from the category of maybe toward the category of who. The database did not cough up a name. It did something else. It found cousins. Distant, whispering matches that leaned toward a cluster of people with the same old country and the same 3 letters starting their surname. A genealogical consultant with a corkboard mind and a laptop that never slept began to draw trees. He pulled census images like old wallpaper, marriage records with soft ink, and property deeds that spelled the same name differently in 3 consecutive lines. The branches narrowed toward a pair of brothers whose ages made sense, and whose addresses, during the year that mattered, sat within a radius you could walk in the time it takes to finish a cup of coffee. While that tree grew inward, a different branch of the work looked outward toward the canal's banks and the road that had fed it. A neighbor, shown a photograph of the recovered object under a neutral caption, said she remembered a scraping sound on a weeknight years back, a sound like metal dragging its reluctance across concrete. She had turned down her radio to listen, then turned it back up, because what could there possibly be to do about a sound when you don't know its name? A retired groundskeeper remembered a tire track that had appeared one morning on the service road, so close to the edge you'd scold a teenager for trying it. He had photographed it out of instinct and forgotten the photograph at the back of a drawer where string and screws and extra screws live. He brought it in now, and the tread pattern, though weathered by the cheap ink of an ancient printer, had enough geometry to stand next to a database of patterns and ask a question. The answer was not a brand. It was a category, a class of tire used on work trucks during a handful of production years that enclosed the year that mattered like a parenthesis. The task force relearned an old lesson that day. The small things you do not throw away can become the bridge between a whisper and a name. Under the lab's light, the pendant weighed almost nothing, and yet, when they pried open its tiny hinge, they found, tucked like a kept promise, a postage stamp photo of a dog with one flopped ear. On the inner rim of the locket, a hair had latched itself, light, long, and human. It came away reluctantly under a microforceps and slid into a tube. The mitochondrial analysis would later say, What mitochondrial analyses say: a maternal line, a match to the known, and a reinforcement that stories sometimes circle back to where they started and nod. That night, the board in the incident room reorganized itself without anyone touching it. Photographs traded places. The word downward remained, but someone underlined it twice, then drew a sister word alongside it: within. What had been lost below had led them to what might be found inside. Inside archives, inside metal, inside the slow work of patience. One detective who never wrote much on the board took a marker and added 3 smaller words beneath the pair: "We are close." No one erased them. Not because they believed in omens, but because a room needs a compass, even when everyone already knows which way they're pointed. The tree narrowed to a fork, and forks always ask the same question: which branch holds weight? One brother lived 2 cities away in a cul-de-sac that hummed with sprinklers and early bedtimes. The other lived alone, in a squat rental off a frontage road, where the nights felt 1 watt dimmer than they should. Paper records said both had worked with their hands. Payroll slips showed long weeks and cash advances. A faded application listed box truck experience in neat block letters. Their ages fit the geometry of the DNA. Their addresses, in the year that mattered, fell into the circle the map had been drawing around itself for months. The unit made a decision that sounded simple and felt like glass. They would not knock. They would not announce. They would stand back and watch the days turn. And when the ordinary produced what it always does: coffee cups, food wrappers, and a cigarette crushed in a hurry, they would lean on the lawful miracle of what people leave behind. Surveillance settled like dust. A sedan became part of the street. A camera learned the rhythm of porch lights and the way the neighbor's dog barked at nothing after 11. Logs grew dense with timestamps: departures at dawn, returns at dark, and a detour to a self-serve car wash, even though rain had done the job for free. The brother in the cul-de-sac lived as if the world were a schedule printed on cardstock. The brother in the rental drifted early some days, at noon others, and one midnight run made the watchers stir. At a corner market that smelled of citrus cleaner and stacked cardboard, he bought coffee thick as grief and leaned against a sun-warmed wall to drink it. When he flicked the cup into the bin, the motion was casual enough to miss. It did not. An undercover hand passed by moments later, retrieving the cup with gloved fingers and the kind of careless posture you practice for weeks. The chain of custody began right there: a line from plastic to evidence tape to a seat in the back of a car, and then to a lab where machines hum their quiet version of prayer. They did not stop at one. A fast food bag folded once and tucked under an elbow came next. A water bottle with teeth marks on the cap. A cigarette collected from the gravel lip of a parking lot. Its filter stained the color of bad sleep. Each item found its own pouch, its own number, and its own place in a sequence that would later unspool on a screen for 12 strangers to consider. While the science stitched in the background, the human work moved forward. A woman who had been a nursing student in the year that mattered now wore the tired patience of someone who stands for a living. She remembered walking home along the arterial where the dark hushes sound. There had been an older truck idling near the service road that ran parallel to the canal. Older, with a sun-bleached cap and a missing center cap on the rear wheel. It was the missing that made her recall it all these years later. She had glanced at the driver because fear trains you to look. He had hair cut close, and a jaw that didn't quite decide whether to clench. She could have sworn he wore a jacket too heavy for the heat, and she remembered thinking only someone who moves from a cab to air conditioning all day would choose that silhouette after dusk. Shown a current photograph of the rental brother, and a younger one with the years peeled away, she pressed her lips together and tapped the younger image once, then looked away like someone who has finished saying a true thing and does not want to say it again. Map work joined memory. The incident room whiteboard was filled with threads that were not decorative but directional. Phone tower pings from the night that mattered. Coarse, imprecise, but suggestive, touched the same corridor of road that ended at the service gate. A gas receipt, wrinkled and patient in the bottom of a banker's box, put a card swipe at a pump on the right side of the highway, at a time when the clock and the radio put songs in a row. A ledger from an equipment yard documented a late return the next morning, signed, rushed, with a note about mud on the tires scrawled with the kind of annoyance that doesn't imagine it will someday be read aloud. Back at the lab, the DNA did what DNA does when asked correctly. The cup yielded a profile that stood up on its own legs. The filter backed it like a second witness. The swabs from the recovered seatbelt hardware and the fabric scrap from the back seat, thin as a fallen leaf and just as stubborn, breathed out their markers one by one until two sets of data faced each other like twin constellations that had been separated by years rather than light. The analyst printed the overlays on transparent film and slid them together on a light box. Points aligned. Gaps disappeared. The match statistic, when it arrived, did not scream. It whispered probability into the room until even the walls leaned closer. The number was the kind that makes defense counsel blink and then shift strategies. It did not eclipse the need for caution. It fed it. With probable cause blooming like a bruise, the team widened the circle to include the other brother. They brought him in on a pretext as thin as thread and watched how he sat square, alert, and confused in the honest way of a man unused to the room. He agreed to a buccal swab with a shrug that made the detective across the table exhale. The return came back clean of the profile from the car. The fork gave its answer, not with drama, but with the weightless relief of a floor that holds. Outside, the heat was flattening the horizon into a mirage. Inside, the timeline grew a spine. They rebuilt the night not as a myth, but as a chain, scene to scene, check to check, leaving blanks where blanks belonged, and filling them only when something sturdy presented itself. The student's departure. The last text, with its ordinary promise. The darkness between street lamps is like commas in a long sentence. The idle of a truck by a service road. The hard left turn was through a gate meant for maintenance, not passage. The geometry of a bumper aligning with a guardrail. The slow shove that tipped weight toward water. The belt tongued into the buckle by a hand that was not hers. The long quiet afterward. No monologue. No confession. Just marks on matter and the way water keeps secrets until it doesn't. The prosecutor came in with sleeves rolled and 2 pens. He listened, then asked for holes. Where do we lose her? Where do we find him? What do we hand a jury that will still be true after someone tries to tear it? They pointed to the recovered vehicle, the identification, the seatbelt hardware, the mitochondrial echo from the locket, the genealogical tree narrowed to a family, the direct comparison from the cup to the backseat fabric, and the witness who could say he had seen a face and a shape under that streetlight that fall. He nodded and said the word that means both risk and direction. Proceed. The warrant process began with affidavits written like architecture, each beam resting on a previous one, the whole weight distributed across facts until it could bear scrutiny and weather. They tucked in photographs that did not shock so much as accumulate. The service road scar, the old tire tread photograph set beside a chart, the equipment yard note with its practical complaint, and the overlay from the light box. A judge leaned forward, read slower as the pages turned, and signed with a pen that had been waiting for months to matter. Teams were assigned and rehearsed. Not because the act required improvisation, but because the morning should not hold any more surprises than necessary. They studied the rental brother's habits like a language exam. What time he walked out, which pocket he favored, and whether he looked left first or right before crossing the scrub of lawn to the curb. And then, like all operations that absorb your days and invade your dreams, reality veered. The sedan on watch saw him emerge, carrying 2 boxes he had never carried before. One was the size that fits old paperwork. The other held the exhausted shape of a duffel. He locked the door and did not look back at the windows the way people do when they expect to return. He placed everything in the trunk and sat in the driver's seat for a long minute with his hands on the wheel, breathing as if he were trying to convince his body to agree with his mind. The call went out in a clipped voice that made the room go still. He's moving, bags loaded, unknown destination. The street, so quiet all summer, felt suddenly like a corridor where the end door had just swung open. The plan adjusted, a muscle memory the team did not know they had. The warrant packet lay on the passenger seat of an unmarked car, ready to become action instead of paper. Engines turned over. Radios clicked once, twice, as if clearing a throat. In the lab, the overlay on the lightbox still glowed, two patterns fused into one, while outside, tires rolled toward an intersection where the morning would decide how much more patience to justice would have to learn. The convoy formed like a thought you cannot shake. Quiet, decisive, inevitable. One unmarked car held the warrant packet on the passenger seat. Corners softened by handling, signatures still wet in the ink's memory. Another carried a case agent, whose heartbeat had found the frequency of the turn signal. A third tucked in 2 streets behind. A ghost that watched roofs more than taillights. The rental brother eased onto the feeder road as if practicing caution could change the speed of consequences. He took the ramp with deliberate restraint, merged, drifted right, then left, then right again. The kind of uncertain weaving that is part habit, part test. The radio murmured distances, lanes, and exits that had names, but felt like numbers in a sequence ticking toward execution. When he signaled for a lane that would slip south farther from the addresses in the warrant and closer to a horizon without promises, the decision arrived not as drama, but as a planned sentence reaching its verb. The lead car accelerated, the second mirrored, and the third closed the rear as if the road had narrowed on its own. Lights that had been sleeping woke in a quick stutter. The siren let out a single syllable that said, "Enough." He looked in the rear view, and you could see the moment when a man recognizes the story has already been written past the page he's on. He pulled to the shoulder, gravel spitting against the undercarriage, and sat still with his hands on the wheel in the pose of someone who wishes shape could substitute for innocence. Commands came shaped like care. Show your hands. Step out. Turn. Kneel. It ended in cuffs that clicked like punctuation. The boxes in his trunk were ordinary in the way evidence prefers. One for paper, one for what people tell themselves they might need if the first plan fails. Clothing folded with anxious precision. A coil of cash binding itself tight, a passport with the weightless arrogance of a booklet. The warrant slid from paper to action, and the team divided the work as if they were laying out tools in a line. Search the vehicle, photograph the positions, seal, label, load. The rest of the team peeled away to the rental, where blinds had always stayed half closed against the afternoon. The door met the key like an answer. Inside, the air held an inventory of old coffee, dust, and the patient electricity of devices asleep. The living room had a low table with ring stains that mapped long nights. A shelf carried trophies from no sports manuals and a few dog-eared magazines with articles about engines and lift capacities and hauling ratios. The kitchen, cramped and resigned, had a drawer that stuck at 2 inches and yielded under a firm, steady pull. Inside, a bundle of nylon ties, rubber banded together beside a roll of duct tape that had sacrificed most of its outer layer to past jobs. Evidence does not convict by association, the case agent told herself, and took the photographs anyway. In the bedroom, a box under the bed held what everyone hopes never to find and must, when it is present, address calmly. Maps with creases sharpened by repetition, a marker dark trail drawn along maintenance roads that skirt water, and a loop around a service gate that had been nothing on paper until it was everything in practice. One map had 3 small check marks at river bends. One check mark intersected a circle drawn in the ink of a different pen. A layer added later, perhaps after a reconnaissance, perhaps after a memory became a routine. Beside the maps sat a notebook with the proud humility of cheap stationery. Pages catalogued weeks in the tidy print of a man who mistook neatness for order. Most entries are practical oil changes, invoices, and callback tea. One entry stood alone in a month otherwise blank. A date and a single verb. Done. Evidence text had the reflex of care. Bag, seal, duplicate, log, handoff. On a lower shelf, a jacket weighted with the slumped posture of heavy cloth. Wool blend. Too warm for most evenings, unless you spend them stepping from insulated cabs to air-conditioned bays and back again. A cuff showed a scuff of something that could be oil, or earth worked to darkness by handling. The jacket went into its own bag with its own tag, and in the chain of custody, a small note compared the weave to recovered scrap. In a desk, another box. Inside, loose photographs, the color of memory, were 50% faded. Landscapes taken from behind a windshield, dirt roads, a fence, and a waterline that seemed to retreat with the day. One plastic sleeve with undeveloped, instant film sheets, long dead. Beneath them, a stack of receipts, late-night gas, convenience store coffee, and a car wash run the morning after a storm took the sky hostage. The living room wall had a nail with no picture on it, a small square of unstained paint like ghost skin. They photographed the absence and moved on. At the station, he sat in an interview room that had swallowed hundreds of explanations and returned none. The camera blinked its steady red. He watched the blank wall, jaw set in that not quite clench. The case agent read his rights in a voice that sounded less like authority than like ritual. He agreed to talk, then asked for water, then asked if he could smoke, then laughed at himself for asking because the room makes everything you want sound like permission. The first question wasn't the kind that asks for confession. It asked for his days, his habits, his roots, and the kind of calendar a man lives with, without ever writing. He answered with the careful confidence of someone who has rehearsed being ordinary. When the agent set the photograph of the map on the table and asked about the circles, he said, "Fishing," the way people do when they need an activity that explains proximity to water. When she slid the notebook closer and said, "Help me understand this," he shrugged and said, "Finish the job." When she said the words that always draw heat, car, service road, belt, he stared at the table and found the decision between two phrases. Eventually he said, "You're wrong," then said, "This is crazy," then said, "You can't prove what you think." He asked for a lawyer, like a man carving a door in a wall that does not have one. The interview ended with the gentle choreography of protocol. In another room, technicians unfolded the jacket with gloved hands and cut careful triangles from seams no one sees when wearing a thing. Under a scope, the fibers built their lattice. A swab pulled sweat traces from the inner collar, where habit stains fabric with persistence. The lab machines whispered their long syllables, and while they whispered, the evidence gathered its chorus. The map ink matched the brand found in the kitchen drawer. The jacket weave harmonized with the scrap from the recovered back seat. A fleck in the cuff turned out not to be oil, but a fine grit, consistent with riverside soil samples cataloged years ago in binders that had been patient in their usefulness. A drawer in the rented garage yielded a tire invoice from a year that intersected with an old tread photograph archived in the original binder, making the model and width. Even if coincidences sometimes stack, they do not usually align with this kind of choreographed precision. Across town, the family sat at a kitchen table that had learned to hold both coffee and grief. The call came with careful sentences that said action had been taken, a person was in custody, searches were underway, and charges would be filed as soon as the ink could bear them. Elena did not ask for details. She said the name she had said every morning for years, and then put her face in her hands. Tomas went to the porch and stood with his palm against the post, like a man steadying a structure that actually needed nothing but time. A neighbor left a slice of cake on a plate, because sometimes language fails and sugar stands in. The case agent stayed late, wrote early, and stacked facts until fatigue asked to be considered. She sent the first packet to the office that decides which charges get to carry the dignity of the state. The request was thorough and calm. Identification of the recovered remains. The physical link between fabric and garment. The biological link between garment and man. The geographic link between man and road and water. The temporal link between map and date and movement. The prosecutor read under the lamp that makes everything look like winter, and nodded alone at his desk, then scrawled the words that move a case from whisper to statement. File the count. Prepare the announcement. Do not overpromise. Tell the truth, and let the truth do the rest. The courthouse woke with a low, inevitable hum. Doors sighed, cameras gathered, and he stood between deputies in a borrowed suit that fit like a lie. The clerk read the charge in a voice worn smooth by repetition. Words that once lived in interviews and binders finally found a docket. A life taken, a plan concealed, a town asked to carry silence as if it were ordinary. Bail was not considered. The defense said, contamination, like a mantra. The prosecutor set evidence in a clean row of fiber under magnification, collar weave under the same lens, and lab figures that do not negotiate. He didn't say inevitable. He didn't need to. In the lab, machines spoke in decimals. A swab from a jacket collar walked the path from glass slide to sequencer to printout. The number that folds doubt into a corner landed on the page so small it felt like zero without saying zero. In a neighboring room, steel met memory. A chipped sawtooth matched a groove on a seat latch, and contact turned into a signature. Across town, a hard drive surrendered the kind of cruelty that arrives as casual text. How far a car sinks, how long a river keeps a secret, and how to clean a buckle. Intention distilled into timestamps. Not far from the canal, a maintenance worker remembered a night with wind and an engine where engines don't idle. A man flicked a cigarette he didn't smoke, asked for directions without asking for help, and stood like someone who believed the water belonged to him. Shown a photograph. The worker nodded, the way caution nods when conscience is tired of waiting. In a storage unit that smelled like dust and apology, a cassette slept at the bottom of a box, labeled with years and question marks. The footage stuttered, then held, taillights easing through a fence breach toward the maintenance road. A time code, married to a phone ping, to a receipt, to a single, handwritten verb in a small notebook. Even one frame can make a room forget to breathe. The defense wrote motions that asked the river to absolve them. This fabric could be anyone's, this map for fishing, this verb about a diet begun. The prosecutor answered with declarations and chains of custody, with the analyst's quiet certainty and the custodian's careful signature. No drama, just a lattice. The family learned court schedules like a new calendar. Arraignment, hearing, motion, conference. They found the bench with the wider window, touched a candle by the door each time they left the house, and spoke to strangers who had nothing to offer but presence. In the bureau, a timeline grew flags, recovered tape witness statement, grit on a cuff that matched sediment at a particular bend, and a toll snapshot catching the suggestion of a grill under sodium light. To outsiders, it was clutter. To the team, it was a shoreline. A date was set. The judge spoke, both sides nodded, and the room emptied. He was led away, the door closed with a softness unfit for what it contained. Outside, the wind had cooled. A reporter asked if this felt like justice. The case agent weighed the word and said, "It feels like truth," beginning to speak in full sentences. She didn't add the rest. Truth is not an ending. It is the road you take to one. The courtroom felt colder than the weather outside, a box of light where time stood still. 12 empty chairs filled, a murmur quieted, and the clerk called the case. The state wheeled in ordinary objects turned heavy by meaning. A map, a latch, a sealed square of fabric, and a hard drive in a plastic shell. The prosecutor spoke low and steady, not selling outrage, only sequencing one night. A message, a route that bends toward water, a trunk with a scar that shouldn't exist, and a search history that pretended curiosity was harmless. "Let the evidence speak," he said, and stepped back. The defense lit a lantern called doubt. Water remakes things, they argued. Time multiplies fingerprints. A hobbyist marks maps. A note means nothing without context. They asked the jury to hold space for uncertainty, like a duty rather than a strategy. Witnesses stitched the day together. The maintenance worker from the outflow road identified a chain-link gap and a pair of grooves photographed under sodium light. A lab analyst explained how synthetic fibers keep the smallest stowaways. A brush of skin, a breath long after bodies leave, and why controls and blanks mattered more than adjectives. An evidence tech held a latch under a camera, the screen filled with a tooth-line curve that fit a saw blade recovered from a shelf no one had dusted in years. A digital examiner opened a list that didn't require commentary. How to sync, how to lock, how to vanish, all time-stamped where the timeline aches. The defense tried to peel each layer off the story, suggesting contamination, error, and coincidence, and found that every answer returned to a chain of custody that did not lose a link. The family did not watch the screens. They watched the small necklace on the table, a loop of metal that had survived everything, and now survived this. The defendant chose to speak. He said he didn't know the missing person. He said maps are maps and notes are notes. He said the internet was a hall of mirrors. Cross-examination was simple. A receipt stamped far from home, a surveillance still with a partial plate, and a notebook line underlined on the date that matters. "I like lists," he said. The state rested with a mosaic you could see without squinting. The phone that said coming home, the canal's grooves, the red stars where water runs fastest, the collar that remembered touch, the latch that remembered teeth, and the queries that mistook a browser for absolution. The defense asked for mercy in the form of doubt. They offered a neighbor who said the defendant once carried groceries, and a cousin who said grief can turn shadows into shapes. The state let kindness stand and drift against the weight of other things. The judge read law like a metronome. Beyond a reasonable doubt, weigh credibility, consider evidence, dismiss sympathy. The bailiff gathered the 12 into a room with a clock and carafes of water. The door closed softly, unfit for the role everyone asked it to play. Outside, the corridor emptied. Evening pushed its hand across the windows. The jury asked for the map, for the control page from the lab, and for the single verb in the notebook. No verdict yet. The family drove home by the long route, past the dark water that forgets slowly. In the kitchen, a candle waited not for hope as it was, but for continuity. In her notebook, the case agent wrote one line, "Last turn ahead." The verdict arrived the way real endings do, not with spectacle, but with a steady word carried across a quiet room. Guilty. The family did not cheer. They exhaled. The defense went still. The state nodded once, and a hand in the front row closed around a necklace that had outlasted years. Outside, microphones waited for thunder, but the spokesman's voice stayed plain. Thank you to the team, to the lab, and to the people who refused to forget. An appeal was promised. The word drifted like dust and did not change the weight in the room. Sentencing came weeks later, under a sky so bright it felt intentional. The prosecutor spoke in sequence. A technician explained how small traces endure. A statement from the family described an empty chair kept at the table because removing it felt like betrayal. The judge named a term that does not end, and the gavel's wooden breath made it official. Afterward, the hallway filled with handshakes that were not congratulations, only acknowledgments that the long night had given way to something steadier. The case agent returned to the canal not as a hunter, but as a witness, eyes on the patched fence where silver links caught the sun, fingers on the weld that had closed its absence with heat. Repair is a quiet verb, it held. In an office of humming lights and beige carpet, a green tag was slid onto a spine, and the folder found its place on a shelf marked closed. On a whiteboard, the agent wrote 3 words: "Evidence keeps talking," and beneath them a number underlined twice. In meetings where budgets breathe or starve, slides showed the lesson. Prioritize preservation. Do not rush the first pass. Map the ordinary routes like storylines, and fund the freezer before the billboard. A neighbor lit one more candle, not to change outcomes, but to keep muscle memory alive. At the canal, the family brought a small bundle of flowers, said thank you to someone who should have been there to hear it, and watched the water carry color downstream. In their kitchen, the candle by the photo was finally pinched out, not as surrender, but to make room for other light. Keys returned to the peg. Mail arrived. A plant on the sill asked for water. The day demanded ordinary tasks and was obeyed. Later, the narrator spoke to the camera with that measured cadence the audience knew. Cold cases never die. They wait until evidence finds a voice. He asked viewers to stay with the work, to subscribe, and to keep their attention trained on the long distances where the next thread might glint. The screen fell to black. That was not an ending, only a pause between stories. In the quiet office, the exit sign hummed over shelves. On a desk, a new file waited for a hand to open it and listen.